Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. If you're struggling in your marriage, or maybe you're wondering if it's even salvageable, before you give up or before you let things get too hard, let us come alongside you and help you solidify your marriage. We offer biblical encouragement and insight to help you strengthen your marriage. Today we're joined by Anna McLaughlin. She is a grateful wife, a homeschooling mama of 4, an entrepreneur, and, most importantly, redeemed and transformed child of the Most High God. In her 20s, Anna reached a place of deep brokenness. And from that point, the Lord has taken her on a journey to rebuild foundations, heal wounds, and come to trust in the deep, abiding love God has for his children. Anna loves nothing more than encouraging Proverbs 31 women to be faithful in the little and serve over more, as the parable of the talents calls us to do. Let's listen in to our conversation with Anna McLaughlin.
Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage. We're Doug and Leslie Davis, and today we've got a guest with us that I know will be a blessing. Anna McLaughlin's here. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here, Doug and Leslie.
Oh, we're excited to have you here. We really are. Your message really speaks to God's redemptive story. And so today we're going to be talking about how to build healthy marriages when you come from broken beginnings. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Absolutely. So I was raised in a non-Christian home. My older brother was 9 years older than I, and my parents' marriage was a little rough when he was growing up, but then by the time I came along, they ended up getting divorced shortly after he left for college. So my hero had gone off to college, my parents' marriage dissolved, and then within a very short period of time, my father remarried, and then he contracted leukemia and was paralyzed through a clinical trial. So I went from what seemed a pretty stable beginning, although I was a very anxious, very nervous, uncomfortable, fearful child. So I had a lot of internal stuff already, even before my parents' divorce. And then those quick successions of kind of, for a child, traumatic events during my formative years, kind of from 10 to 13 is when most of those things happened, really set me off the rails. And so by the time I reached my early 20s, I was kind of I had been a Christian since my later elementary years. I came to faith kind of just almost, of course, never accidentally, but not in any way that was planned by my family. I had just heard the gospel at a church camp, but I had gone to a non-believing church, and so heard the gospel, and it was like a home that I'd always known but never known the name of. And so although I was a Christian, there was just this deep disruption in my life. I was suicidal in my 20s, and I said to the Lord, I want you to take me out. I don't think that I can repair the damage that I do in relationships. I don't know how to heal. I don't know how to seek reconciliation when there's a challenge in friendships or in dating relationships. He didn't do that. He brought my husband into my life about 3 years later. But what he found was what I like to call a wounded bird. I was very broken and very insecure. So that's how we began our marriage, was with this wounded bird and a man who really did not know what he was getting into.
But by God's grace, right? By God's grace, we move
Always.
through those traumatic events, and the Lord brings people alongside of us that just help in that healing. And
Right.
I really think that the marriage relationship can be one of those places when it's submitted to the Lord. It can be really one of those healing places.
Right. And a lot of our listeners might not be able to relate to every step of your process, but I know that there's a lot of our listeners that can relate to part of it, whether it's the anxiousness, the anxiety, or the effects of a divorce on a child. And I know that even with just one of those things going on, if you're dealing with anxiety or if you're dealing with divorce, it can be really difficult. Since you got to experience both of those, when you're in a place of brokenness like that, where can you start to find healing and wholeness?
So for me, the beginning really was telling the truth to the Lord. He knows it anyway, but to say to him, and that was the point that I came to in my early 20s where I said, I don't even know, I believe in the gospel, but I don't see any evidence of it in my life. I feel like in some ways I feel more broken, more lost than I did in my childhood. And yet I've been walking with you for, over 10 years. And so I just said, Lord, fall me back in love with you again. Like, I don't even know that I like you right now. And that was as a Christian, I knew the right answer, right? And so it was very terrifying for me to say, I have nothing left but this shambles of a story, and being willing for him to rebuild me brick by brick.
What a beautiful, honest heart, though. And I think God wants us to be able to take the things we think we should say and just lay those aside and say the things that we're really dealing with. And what a great process he brought you through.
Now, were you
That's
married
right.
at that time when that was your prayer? Had the Lord brought your husband into your life by then?
That was before he and I met, about 3 years before he and I met. And so there was still, thankfully, I had begun the process of healing, which I think was the only way that I was even really ready for him. I had tended to be drawn to very chaotic, very intense relationships, and by his protection, I tended to actually chase after guys who didn't even end up dating me. We would just be friends, and I would long from afar. And so I really feel like the Lord covered me in many ways. And then my husband came into the picture after I had gone through a bit of a tumultuous relationship, and said, Lord, I called it fasting dating. I'm going to fast dating for the next 40 days, which seemed like such a short period of time. But I was like, okay, God likes 40 days. So we're going with that.
Yes.
And then on the 40th day, actually, my husband and I had our first phone conversation.
Oh, wow. Wow. And that's, that's too big to be a coincidence, right?
I know.
Those little things that the Lord does that are too big to be a coincidence.
He's so kind.
Yes. Oh, yes. He's so kind. So tell us what happened next.
Okay, so we had he was not my typical choice. I was a corporate lawyer at the time. I just started practicing law in my hometown, and he was a kind of a more of a blue collar guy. And we used to joke. I came to our marriage with just a room full of books, and he owned one book, which was the Bible.
Well, thank you, Lord, right?
You can only own one. That's a good one to own.
It's a good one to own. That's right. And he just was without drama. And so for this drama girl, that was a big change, and one that I honestly really struggled with, and has been something that we've really had to work through in our marriage. I wanted that intensity. I wanted the chase. I wanted to feel special because he was, crying over me and writing me heartfelt letters. And interestingly enough, the man that I had dated before wrote me a letter in the course of my early relationship with my husband, Brian. And I read the letter to him. I said, I got this letter. This guy is asking for me back. And Brian just looked at me and said, well, I really hope that you decide to keep going with me. I think we have something really special, and but I obviously can't control you. And I had to have a reckoning with the Lord, where it's like, I wanted this scene, right? I wanted this drama. And my big brother said to me, Anna, so often the one who makes the grand gesture is also the one who did the thing to begin with that required a grand gesture. And he said, simple and sweet is not a bad thing. And so it's been such a gift from God to have this journey to become one with a man that I feel like my natural, the story I write in my mind, the romance movies that we watch and the books that we can read, which I tend to put to the side now because I think they can be really damaging for us as women. Those tell us a different story. It's got to be dramatic. It's got to be the Notebook. And when we look around and realize kindness, what does the Lord give us? The fruits of the Spirit. They're very sweet things: love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. That's what we want in a partner.
Yes.
Yeah. And two, when your husband said that, and there was no drama around that put you in a position where you had to make a choice.
Yes.
It wasn't I'm going to fight for you and keep you or control you or whatever. You had a choice to make at that point. And so, and God does that. Like he puts us together with the people who grow us the most if we're submitted to him. I know
That's right.
out of the people that I dated through high school, and then I met Doug, and we were 18 and a half, almost, no, we were I was 17 and a half when we met. So we met when I was young, and we were married by the time we were 20. And everybody was like, that is way too young to be getting married. And even now, even more so now, like people are waiting a lot longer to get married than what they did when we were, getting married. And, but the relationship that he gave us was so healing, because I had to press into those choices, just like you described, like, and then when you make that choice, you've made a commitment to the relationship.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yes. And then along came kids, right?
Very quickly after we got married, I remember asking my husband, how long do you want to wait before we start trying for a family? He said, I definitely want a honeymoon period, like 4 to 6 months.
Yeah.
I was like, that's not much, but okay. And that was exactly
right.
what happened. Yeah, we had our first child within just over a year of our marriage. And now we have 4 children, ages 11 to 5.
Oh, I bet that keeps you busy.
Yes, we homeschool them. My husband and I both have businesses on the side, and so we've really built our life around just seeking to, really pour into our children and raise our family well.
So, how did bringing that brokenness background into the relationship, and then starting your family so quickly, how did that kind of play out, and how did the Lord just cover you during that time?
There was a lot that got worked out kind of on the run. It felt like I was still working as a corporate lawyer during my first child's toddler years. We left the law firm when she was about 2. And so it was an intense work situation. It was an intense pace of having our children, to have 4 children in 6 years. And my mental health was even further compromised. I was already anxious and prone to probably depression, but didn't know to call it that. And then compounding that with the tax on the body of having so many children in a short period of time, I would end up kind of on the kitchen floor, curled up, and telling Brian, like, something's wrong with my mind, something's wrong. It was almost like I was just a raw nerve. And here we have these little kids, and we're trying to homeschool, and we had some developmental challenges that we were working through. And so I had this picture of what a healthy family should look like, but it wasn't anything I'd experienced before. So there was this deep questing before the Lord. Do other people have these challenges too, and they just don't say them out loud? Am I alone? Am I unwell? Am I normal? I had no idea. And compounding that with the fact that I hadn't really learned how to build good relationships before my 20s meant that I really didn't have a good mirror other than the Lord. And so there were many times where I would try to wake up early to have time with him, and then a baby would wake up or a toddler would wake up, and I would just get on my face, sometimes lock myself in the bathroom for 2 or 3 minutes while there were fingers waggling under the door trying to get my attention, and just cry out, Lord, I don't know what to do. And the thing that I love about him so much is he uses that. It can be 3 minutes. It can be completely desperate and broken. And I think what we so often can lose sight of, especially when we're in that point of crisis, is the story isn't over until it's good, right? And that may be a decade or 4 decades or whatever, but I'm 30 years into walking with him, and about 15 to 20 years into this deep healing that he really started in my early 20s. And now I can say, look at all you've done, but it takes some time sometimes.
Yeah. Sometimes it's not a quick fix or a miracle. And I can say, from experience, you're not the only one that's been in the bathroom on our face with little fingers, underneath of the door. And we had a time when our kids were school aged, about the same age as your kids are now, probably. And he was working a full-time job and a pastorate, and I decided to go back to school for a master's degree. Oh, yes, that was
Wow.
Chu was right. Yeah. It was hindsight, looking back on it, I probably would have done it a little differently than what I did, but I still ended up taking a longer amount of time. It took longer than 2 years to get the master's degree for a 2-year program. But I know I would have been more intentional with my children just in that time, because their lives were also, chaotic too, with just life stuff, softball and school and church and, all of the things. And I think in fact, I know I would have been more intentional about pouring into their life during that time. And so tell us about how the Lord has equipped you to pour into your children's lives, even coming out of this brokenness, this broken background.
Yes. One of the things that I think my background in particular has given is we work really hard to bring no hypocrisy into our home. So we are very honest with our children about, the first scripture I taught my daughter was all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And, we remind her that's us too. That's mommy and daddy too. They do have permission to call us on our stuff. They do have permission to, just say, I don't think you should have said that way, or, that didn't sound very kind. And we work hard to have true intimacy with our children, in that when there's been a harsh word, or when we've spoken from a place of frustration, or even just practically when we're on our phone and scrolling and they're trying to talk to us, we really try to repair that, even with our little ones, and say, I apologize. Like I was distracted. I was not paying attention to you. I was harsh, or whatever it is. And so I think that's one thing. And, coming from a typical hallmark of a family that maybe doesn't function as healthily as it could, is this kind of gaslighting of, oh no, it's your problem. And so I really thought there was a magical age that you just became perfect. And because there had been no context in my home of really reckoning with sin. My parents weren't believers as they were raising me. And so that, even though my parents were dealing with deep challenges with their divorce and everything like that, somehow I still thought that they knew what to do. So when I reached adulthood and felt so lost, it was a real crisis for me, because I was sure this is proof that it's my issue, that there's something deeply wrong with me. And so that's something we talk about with our children a lot, is just the arc of sanctification, that all their lives they will be practicing kindness. All their lives they will be endeavoring to love better, endeavoring to know God better. And so I think, having come from a really just challenging beginning within my own mind and in my circumstances, it's made me much more mindful to clarify for them, you're doing a great job. You're on the road, and it takes time.
Well, and that is such a beautiful lesson. And I hope our listeners who are relating to this can understand it's okay to let your kids know, I did that wrong and I'm sorry. And
Yes.
I'm going to continue to strive to do things the right way too, because, you were mentioning as a child, you thought that someday I'll be an adult who's got it all together. And
Yes.
I still haven't found that age when, as an adult, I have it all
neither.
together.
When is that?
But the beauty when you're sharing that with your kids now, God's using what he's taught you to teach them at a much earlier age that there's going to be things that go wrong, and there's going to be things that aren't working the way you want them to work. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It just means that there was something wrong in the way that you did that thing, but there's always the opportunity to do it right the next time. There's always the opportunity to seek the forgiveness of God. There's always the opportunity to ask the Holy Spirit to raise up in you the things you don't currently have, so that you can be what he wants you to be. What a just beautiful lesson to teach our kids. And I hope that our listeners realize you're not alone. You're not the only one that feels like I'm messing this up. We've
That's
all
right.
been there.
Oh yeah,
Right.
we were there too with our kids. Oh my goodness. Yeah. The stories I could tell you.
I'm sure we'll get to hear them as the podcast continues.
As the podcast goes on, right?
Yeah, and our children now as adults are probably listening to this as well, going, yeah, we remember that. But the good news is, by God's grace, they all made it to adulthood.
Yeah.
There you go. That's a win.
Yeah, that was a win. Absolutely. So,
and one of the things that I've realized, Doug, is just the the importance of recognizing that it's not just about our marriage. As my husband and I are working through things, as we're allowing the kids to see us work through things, it's not about, do Brian and I have a happy marriage? Ultimately, the work of all of us as Christians is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And so, especially with my beginning in a non-Christian home, I've loved the idea of, God seeks to take us from glory to glory in order to glorify Himself. And so my work is actually not to be happy with Brian, although that's a beautiful byproduct of a healthy marriage, not for Brian to be happy, not for the children to be happy, but for us to glorify the Lord. And the idea that choices that I make to humble myself, to repent, to seek forgiveness, to seek reconciliation are actually things that can have an impact not only in this moment, but into the generations. That God says, I bless the children of the faithful to the 1,000th generation. That it is so critical for me to endeavor to be righteous today, not just for myself, but for the generations that follow. And I will just add one little tool that has been such a gift to me. There's a book called The Abolition of Marriage that describes the statistical impact on a family choosing to stay together. And it even talks about a man of God and then an atheist that lived at the same time, I think in the 1800s, and the generational impact on that man who lived in the 1800s. I think it was Jonathan Edwards, how his family went on to be ministers and politicians and senators and all of these people of deep impact and deep integrity, whereas the man who had been a renowned atheist at the time had criminals and people who ended up, just having horrible impact and, not having any not having significant redemptive impact. What I do matters today.
Right. Well, and all of us come from a somewhat of a place of brokenness. I'm glad that you shared what you shared about your life. There may be some of our listeners who are thinking, well, I haven't been through some of the things that Anna's been through, but we all have had things where we've been broken. And one of the beautiful things when we're truly broken before the Lord and we admit that we're broken before the Lord and we give that brokenness to Him, that's where we start to see the healing that can make a difference generationally. That's where we get to see the change that God brings. And you mentioned earlier where God starts to minister in your life, giving you the fruit of the Spirit. You see love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness. And in my case, a lot of self-control. And
me too.
And you get to see that that's something that God alone could do to change you. And you don't realize at the time when God changes you, He's bringing a change in the lives of your children and in their children too. And so, be encouraged. Be encouraged that even if you don't see the results, God's a faithful God. And as He changes you, He's making a difference in your life and in the lives that you will interact with and affect.
That's exactly right.
People will interact with and affect and on for the generations. It is definitely plural, right? It's generations, not just one generation.
That's exactly right.
So good.
I see.
Doug and I want to break in right here in the middle of this episode and tell you about a very special free resource that we've created for you. We know that most couples don't know how to begin a journey to spiritual intimacy. Some couples are just trying to stay on the journey to physical intimacy.
Praying together is one of the most rewarding disciplines of spiritual intimacy. It's the cornerstone and can deepen your love for your spouse and your commitment to your marriage, and that strengthens emotional and physical intimacy.
It's also one of the hardest to actually be disciplined at. Things come up, excuses bear weight, time gets away from us. That's why we developed this brief guide to praying with your spouse. It includes how to overcome common barriers and 7 things to consider.
Just as there are many reasons why it's difficult to pray together, there are equally as many ways to push through the barriers and incorporate a habit that will draw the two of you close to God and closer to each other.
We know firsthand, and we're living proof that spiritual intimacy can be developed by praying with each other.
To get this free guide called Praying with Your Spouse, a brief guide, just follow the link below.
And now, back to our show.
Well,
Well, it sounds like you're very intentional in your parenting. And that makes me assume that you're probably pretty intentional in your marriage also. What are some of the things that you and your husband do to create an intentional atmosphere in your marriage?
Mm-hmm. So we try to let little things be important, because as we were raising our children, I left the practice of law when our oldest was 2. So we went through a season where money was very tight, time was very tight with the kids, and so we had a habit of I would say, so physical touch is my big love language. And so I've learned to ask for what I need instead of getting mad that I don't have it, right? Instead of getting mad, he doesn't read my mind. And so I would plop down on the couch next to my husband and grab his hand, and we'd just call it a date. Hey, it's a date. It's a date. And we would hold hands. I'd lean my head on his shoulder, and we would just be together as the kids colored on the walls and spilled things everywhere. And even if it was just 5 minutes or holding hands in the car, that we were really intentional about having these moments of connection. We work really hard to clean up any challenges relationally, which he's a truth teller. He's very bold and strong in his words. I'm more of a feeler. I tend to get my feelings hurt very easily. As a lawyer, words are very important to me. And so we have plenty of moments of challenge. And I've learned to work against my nature, which early in our marriage, I would literally hide behind doors trying to have a conversation with him, because I was in so much fear and so avoidant in my behaviors. And so leaning into the discomfort of embracing, we are two, we're complementary, like you talked about in your earlier podcast episode about egalitarian versus complementarian. We're complementary, and that means we're going to be different in how we approach things. That's actually a gift. And so we try to lean into that, and it's been really helpful for us. And I don't know how much you guys engage with this in your pastoring and your counseling, but the love language has been very helpful, because with me as physical touch, if I can ask for a hug and have my husband just hold me, that can wipe away so many moments of difficulty and bring connection so fast. Similarly, he is words of affirmation and acts of service. So if I can look at him and say, "You're doing a wonderful job. This actually isn't a criticism of you. I'm just struggling for this moment. Like, you are a wonderful provider. You're a wonderful support. You're a wonderful encouragement." Because he starts to hear, "You're telling me I'm failing," right? Especially as the man of the household. So we really endeavor to work all the way through a thing, even if it starts to look worse before better. Like, our kids will come up sometimes and say, "Stop fighting," and we'll get eyeball to eyeball with them. "We're good. We're going to get to the other side of it. You're going to see it happen. We just need a minute," right? And we'll work it out. We'll actually work it out in front of our children, because that's something that I didn't see in my upbringing. There was just this mysterious bubble of marriage, and then they weren't married anymore. And so it's been really important to us to allow our children to see conflict to resolution again and again, so that they know they're safe, because we know how to get to the other side of things.
Yeah. Oh, I think that is so important. I know in the generation that was my parents' age, now my parents have been passed away for a while, but in that age, the generation that's now in their 90s, they didn't talk about conflict. They didn't talk about sex. They didn't talk about money. They didn't. And it turns out that they had all of that, but they weren't talking about it. So I understand that. It was the same when I was growing up, that we didn't, I didn't see my mom and dad have any conflicts, because that was, taboo to have a conflict in front of the children,
And I had a similar but significantly different experience. I didn't see my parents fight, but I did see them work through resolutions on things. And I didn't even know that they ever argued until I was grown. They had a look that I recognize now, looking back at it. They would give each other a look that meant, "We're going to talk about this later." But the thing that was beautiful is they never disagreed with each other in front of us. And so the only thing that was good about it is I got to see the resolution, just like you're showing your kids, which is a good thing, to show you can work through things, and everybody has struggles. But I never had the opportunity to try to play them against each other, because I never saw them argue with each other.
You didn't know where the weaknesses were.
Right. I couldn't find it.
That's
But
beautiful.
your kids are probably too young to do any of that kind of stuff.
Oh, of course.
Oh, now tell us how old your children are.
Our children are 11, 9, 5, and 7.
Oh, busy household. Busy household. I love it.
Mhm.
We
Yes,
had
it's a
4
lot of
kids
fun.
within
9 years.
within 9 years, about eight
Mhm.
and a half years. And those years were busy. They were just so busy.
Yes, yes. They're always into something, and always we have very different personalities in our home. And so I joke with my kids. I'm like, this is marriage practice. You right here in these 4 walls, you're practicing, because especially our oldest two are so different from each other. And I said, you're not going to pick your own self. It'll be boring. You're going to pick someone who's a lot more like your brother. You're going to pick someone who's a lot more like your sister. This is where you figure out how to honor and respect each other. It'll be so interesting to see what it looks like in 10 or 15 years. Right now, it's a little dicey sometimes. And so we're practicing. We're going to keep practicing.
Yes.
And that's all you can do, because God's faithful through that process. But one of the things that also has made me laugh, and you'll see this as your kids get older, I look at how very different our children are, and how very, very different their husbands. We have 4 daughters. And so our sons-in-law are very different from one another as well. And one of the things that I've noticed is if you tried to switch any of the boys to a different girl, it wouldn't have worked at all. They would have killed each other because they are very different.
Very different.
But what
Yes.
they found wasn't the same as themselves. You're right. It was something that they were brought to by God, and they had to figure out how to live together. And so what great lessons you're teaching your kids.
I remember a time where I had to sit my oldest 2 girls down because they were really, really upset with each other about their choice in men. And of course, this was high school age, this was later high school age. So this was like 17, 18, right around that age. And I had to sit him down and said, look, your sister is not going to choose the same type of man that you would choose. Like, it's gonna be different, and you're just going to have to give your sister permission to
be different
from you.
Mhm,
Right.
mhm.
And because
Oh, so good.
they were struggling.
Mhm.
Oh, those years. So much fun. Yeah, so much fun. Well, Anna, tell us where our listeners can find you.
Yes. So I run a women's faith group called She Considers a Field on Facebook. And the basic idea behind that group is we want to be faithful in the little things before the Lord. And we recognize through my own journey, I've really come to learn with the Lord that the little things we do matter, because in Him they become eternal. And so it's a faith group. I go live every day. We have phone calls or Zoom calls every couple of weeks, do a book study. And I just bring in the different things the Lord's taught me in my own healing journey to share with other women who love Him.
Oh, I
That's
love
awesome.
that. Yes, I absolutely love that. And I will put the link to that in the show notes of today's episode. And so, Anna, it has been an extreme joy to have you today on the podcast. And I'm so excited.
Thank you both so much. It's been wonderful to be here.
Thank you. You've been listening to The Vision Driven Marriage. Our prayer for you is that God will solidify your marriage.